Thanks for being with us tonight. It's great to be here again, and it's great to be here with Mark Jaccard. Mark has been an energy analyst for 30 years. He's been a nonpartisan expert on climate energy policy for governments across the world. Here in Canada, he helped design British Columbia's carbon tax and its clean energy standard. He's a regular contributor to IPCC reports and worked with the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment for nearly 2 decades. When he's not providing insight or testimony, he's a professor of sustainable energy at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. His latest book came out in 2020. It's called The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success: Overcoming Myths That Hinder Progress. It's published by Cambridge University Press. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mark, your book focuses on 10 myths that are keeping us from seriously addressing the climate crisis. These aren't just myths put forward by the fossil fuel industry. There are also some that are championed by people who are, as you say, climate concerned. What do you think is the most insidious myth out there that Canadians should be rethinking?
Well, it's hard for me to rank them. Maybe I'll throw it depends where you're coming from. Just as you pointed out, if we're talking about sort of the self-interest bias that we humans have, so that comes from, sadly, mostly people whose incomes or what they view as the vibrancy of their region, even the survival of their region, is dependent upon ongoing fossil fuel production and consumption. And there's a tendency for those people to propagate myths about how we have to stay on that path. But the point of the book is not to talk about that, because I'm really trying to talk to climate concerned citizens, and most of them are aware of that mythic, delusional side of things. So I'm actually trying to help climate concerned citizens be more strategic and more effective. If you ask people on average, what do we have to do who are climate concerned, they'll say, oh my goodness, we have to change so many things. We have to change our behavior of whether we're driving or flying or eating meat. We have to worry about economic growth and maybe even completely change the economic system we have in order to solve climate. So it just seems like an overwhelming problem. And then a whole bunch of myths spill out of that we have to dramatically change our behavior. Then there's the wishful thinking myths. We want to wish that fossil fuels are bad, so on that side, and therefore renewables are good, and renewables will even soon be cheaper than fossil fuels. And in fact, they won't. And I think that's probably one of the most dangerous myths. And so I spend a fair bit of time on that.
Yeah, you talk about some studies that you conducted, that your students have conducted, that can you unpack that for us a little bit about renewables?
Oh, sure. So, this is worldwide. If I am from 30 years ago, you would have heard stories like peak oil, even peak natural gas, even about how coal will get much more expensive. And the people who work as experts in this area, I'm thinking academics like Peter Odell in the Netherlands 30 years ago, Maury Edelman at MIT, were all able to show that not only is the Earth's crust chock-a-block full of fossil fuels, when the geologists tell us we might be running out of oil, they actually meant conventional oil and didn't even talk about oil that you could get from heavy molasses-like oil, or oil sands, or shale oil, or light tight oil, or deep ocean oil, or enhanced oil recovery, where you can get more oil out of the existing wells. It goes on and on, converting coal into oil-like synthetic fuel products, and same with natural gas. What happens is, as we do more renewables, and we try to force to reduce the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas and the consumption of them, then we drive down the demand. And ironically, it forces more innovation in fossil fuels, and you've seen that, oil sands, shale oil, and it lowers the price. And so right now, if we're moving away from oil, for example, its price will get even lower over the next 2 decades, which is hard for people to realize. But it means that when you say, oh, renewables are cheaper, what do you mean? When you say an electric car will soon be cheaper than an oil burning car, a lot of the evidence does not support that. And that means we have to do something else, and we have to get rid of that myth.
And you say, if we're moving off of fossil fuel, if we're moving away from fossil fuel, that's a big if. Are we, in your opinion?
So it depends on the sector. So do I mean electricity or transportation, some industry? And it depends on the location. So in the last 25 years, the little bit of good news in my career has been that wealthier countries, in many cases, have started to levelize and decrease their emissions. And in fact, if Canada stopped at the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, that from including Manitoba East, Canada's been like many European countries. So Ontario, Quebec, the largest bulk of the population of Canada, in having their emissions go down. But when we look at the whole country, not so much. But the problem is the rise in greenhouse gas emissions is really going to develop as the poorer people in the poorest parts of the world, the developing world, see the use of fossil fuels as an inevitable part of their development path. And I'm involved a lot in this, as you say, through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a utility planner in Indonesia or Pakistan or Tanzania. They're looking at their cheapest options. It's coal or natural gas to make electricity. They're wanting to expand their trucking industry and roads. It's oil and diesel products. So this is
such an enormous problem.
Exactly.
Mark, if we can move on, I wanted to ask you about here in Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau made carbon pricing a major part of his climate action plan. And the federal carbon tax is set to hit $170 by 2030. But in your book, you say this is one of the 10 myths that we must price. The myth is that we must price carbon. What would you say to Mr. Trudeau about this?
And I have had opportunities.
You have said it.
Yes. So basically what I've said, and I even remember saying this to him 10 years ago, and saying it to Stéphane Dion, all I've said was to reduce emissions, because of what you and I were just talking about, renewables won't beat fossil fuels. Fossil fuels will keep falling in price. You have to have a carbon price, like our carbon tax, or like Quebec's cap and trade carbon price, or you need regulations. So my point was actually kind of a small one. It was to tell politicians Trudeau, like Rachel Notley, like Stéphane Dion, like Gordon Campbell, and other politicians around the world, don't let economists or environmentalists, perhaps, or business leaders convince you that the only path to decarbonization is to price carbon, even if that means all that's going to happen is you're going to lose the next election and we're going to end up with politicians who won't price carbon. So that's the myth, is the myth that you have to price carbon. But if you don't price carbon, then you have to use regulations. And I do a lot of work on regulation. So I am not against carbon pricing. I'm against misleading climate sincere politicians into putting a bullseye on their back, and therefore enabling climate insincere politicians to lie, that because the word tax can be very difficult for some swing voters in swing ridings, and they don't trust governments if the government says it's a revenue neutral tax. They don't trust governments when they say it's the cheapest way to reduce emissions, and they play into the hands of politicians who are, quite frankly, knowingly lying to them.
Do you think that Prime Minister Trudeau has put a target on his back, a bullseye, as you say?
To the credit of the Trudeau government, and that's why I get a little edgy when people say it's not a climate sincere government, I can tell you that they did not need to say in 2016, we're going to put out a backstop carbon price and then have to fight a legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court with that. And they didn't have to say in last December that, and by the way, we're sticking to our guns. A rising carbon tax will be a key part of our policies. It's not dominant, there are a lot of other policies, but they've said we're going to stick to that. And I call that, sometimes I've called it, on one conversation I was on, I called it the 905 gamble. And so basically, it's this gamble that enough people in the ridings that tend to determine who's going to form the next government, that enough of those people will be increasingly aware, that's the point of my book, or aware enough to not buy into the rhetoric of that, that this is going to destroy the economy, it's punitive, it's not revenue neutral. And so I don't know what the answer will be, but I'm interested and somewhat impressed that the Liberals are trying this.
I have to ask the inevitable next question, which I'm sure I can't see our chat. I know there are 361 people listening in right now. So I think that somebody has said, yeah, but what about the pipelines they bought? What about the pipeline they bought? How can you say they're climate sincere if they also bought the Kinder Morgan pipeline, Trans Mountain?
So, so first of all, it could be that I'll argue they should have never bought that pipeline and not done it. And still, you could argue that still might be your best bet to reelect that government because it's your best option compared to who else might win. So to me, also, electoral politics and democracy is about maturity. It's about knowing, especially in our voting system, which is not proportional representation, you're really trying to make sure you don't get the worst option. And so you have to think strategically when you vote. And I just see that as something that people need to know about. So that's sort of that part of it. Now, if someone's prime minister of a country that has some regions that are fossil fuel endowed and therefore human beliefs, that's what the book is all about, our beliefs follow our self-interest and our wishful thinking. And so if you have people like that in your country, then you have to seriously think about, even if they don't elect a single person in that riding, in that region that is from my party. So we know the Liberals haven't been able to get people elected in the Alberta, Saskatchewan area. Don't I still need to think about the world from their point of view sometimes as well? Because otherwise, if I'm not thinking strategically like that, I could end up where I create a real resistance movement there. And a country like Canada, with its very diverse regional interests, can very well end up spending 5, 10 years focused on the separatist aspirations of a particular region. And I don't, you know what I'm talking about. I remember when we had some strong climate policy happening, possibly, and the second Quebec referendum ended up taking all the political air and out of the balloon. So if I were in Trudeau's shoes, I can't say to you now, oh, I would just cancel that pipeline. I actually think I could well say, I'm going to build that pipeline because it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. It isn't if Canada doesn't produce that oil, there is so much oil on this planet, someone else will produce it. And so go ahead and produce it. What we need to do is have policies that reduce the demand for oil worldwide, just as we're doing with coal. And when that happens, I'm sad to say this to my Alberta fellow citizens, but Alberta's sort of the highest priced oil producer on the planet. And as the price of oil is falling, it's the one that will get knocked out. And so the fact that you built this pipeline, well, maybe one day you'll convert it to hydrogen or biofuels or I don't know what. But I can see someone building that pipeline, and I know a lot of your listeners might want to get at me for this. I can see someone doing that.
Mark, thank you for that. There are a bunch of questions that arise out of what you just said. One of them has to do with, this really challenging problem that exists, of maturing politically, of facing into some of the realities in democratic countries of, things having to be a compromise. And I really found that point you made fascinating. And you also are talking, you just mentioned world, kind of the world demand and the world sort of the world economy and what will happen with the world. And I wonder if you could speak to your thoughts on, will there ever be, unity around the world. Is that something we can aspire to in terms of addressing climate change? Do you think that could happen?
No. So there will be never be unity around the world on how fast and how hard to go on greenhouse gas reduction. And there will never be unity in Canada on how fast and how hard to go on greenhouse gas reduction. Just as there was never unity in the world on who should do what, when, to stop Nazi Germany, to stop any other kind of global threat. And that is part of the whole maturity of understanding that humans will think are pluralistic. They will think differently. They have different interests. I'm a real follower of Isaiah Berlin and the whole thinking of the importance of respecting different points of view. And so there will be different points of view on the planet. And that means that when you need common action, you have to have penalty mechanisms or enforcement mechanisms. A public good is something like a lighthouse. No person's going to build this lighthouse over here, but society wants the lighthouse because the benefits are great. Government builds the lighthouse and forces the rest of us to pay taxes, or those who can to pay for that. The planet needs to cause greenhouse gases everywhere to go down. And the only way it's going to be able to prevent free riders, that is, people who will be climate laggards, is by having penalty mechanisms. And yet, every year for 27 years now, leaders from all the countries through the UN have come to an annual meeting and tried to craft a voluntary global agreement. Now, I commend the effort, and I am not sort of pissing on these people who do this. They are so sincere and trying so hard. But the interests are so divergent. The ones that you and I talked about initially, where people in the developing world want to use fossil fuels. So we should tax ourselves and pay for them to have a non-fossil fuel burning energy system. But that won't happen because it's an enormous cost. And
you talked about penalties. You were talking about penalties. We need to have penalties. So how would that work?
Right. And that's where I'm headed. We're not going to pay for it. So what's it going to be? Well, it's going to be carbon tariffs of some kind or another. And so we have wasted almost 3 decades not talking about carbon tariffs. Now, finally, and this is my other small glimmer of hope, countries that are starting to really lead and push, the Europeans, for example, are now talking about carbon tariffs. They're saying, you know what, carbon tariffs are part of what we have to do. Now, the Trudeau government last December said its climate initiative through to Paris is going to include exploring with other countries setting carbon tariffs. And there is some hope that the new Biden government, with its America First, will start to say, if we're going to move and affect the steel industry, the aluminum industry, the chemical industry, the cement industry, we have to make sure that American industry is not disadvantaged by countries that even though they are poorer, and this is unfortunate, but in the long run, it would be good for those countries if the planet sets a series of tariffs or credible threat of tariffs. So make sure that no countries are laggards. Otherwise, it won't work. And we need to get to that mindset. And by the way, just one last point, the benefits of that will especially be in the poorer parts of the world. It will, because those are where people are less prepared, economically, organizationally, societally, institutions, infrastructure, healthcare, to be ready for the ravages of climate change. And so to me, it's kind of funny, people who allow themselves to say, oh, we should just voluntarily all agree and we'll pay for them to do that, knowing that their fellow voters will never do that. And what you're doing is condemning people in the developing world to a worse outcome. So I think we need to get real about the need for mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms.
Let's take a moment to dive a little bit deeper into Joe Biden's climate policy, and then we'll come back to Canada. I know on these talks, when we talk about America, there's a lot of people in the chat who are like, no, let's talk about Canada, but I think they're related. And so in this case, so today in the New York Times, Ezra Klein wrote about Biden's climate strategists Thinking along these lines, economists have their ideas for solving climate change, a hefty carbon tax chief among them. But Biden and his team see this as fundamentally a political problem. They view the idea that a carbon tax is the essential answer to the problem of climate change as being so divorced from political reality as to be actively dangerous. What do you say to that, Mark?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not even dangerous for the Americans because it just won't happen. It's a political impossibility right now. Now that can change, but so far, the people elected along with Biden to govern in the U.S. system of government are not about to put in not a carbon tax and not even cap and trade, which is another way of carbon pricing, as I said, which they have in California and we have in Quebec. Um, but that's where you have kind of a bipartisan agreement on climate policy in those two jurisdictions, for example. It doesn't matter who gets elected in Quebec, they'll keep their cap and trade. And today in British Columbia, it doesn't matter who gets elected, we'll keep our carbon tax. But in general, Biden's not going to be able to do, it really doesn't look like it, an economy-wide carbon price like we just succeeded with in our Supreme Court in Canada. So what is he going to do? Well, you can first of all look at what Obama did in similar circumstances. It's been recognized in the courts in the US that the Environmental Protection Agency, which is part of the executive branch, so the head of it is appointed by the president, can regulate CO2 and can regulate the vehicles, the transportation sector, on the basis of CO2 or on the basis of energy efficiency. So first and foremost, I think you're going to see new electricity regulations from Biden and new transportation regulations, vehicle regulations from Biden. And the good news is that in my book, I point out that we need to be working on a global agreement, but at least we can act in our domestic sectors that are not as vulnerable to trade, foreign trade, as would be steel or aluminum, products we're trying to sell, manufacture and sell. And so we'll see quicker action in electricity under a Biden administration. And there's a lot of support for that, even among Republicans, actually. 30 US states have a renewable portfolio standard, including Texas and southern states. So we'll see electricity from Biden. And for Canada, that doesn't even matter. There's no way the Americans get ahead of us. We're already phasing out coal plants thanks to Trudeau's policy. And then he'll work on transportation. And that is an area where it would be great if Americans are really aggressive and Canada could match into that. Because the irony is we really need to fuel switch in transportation. It isn't about more efficient gasoline cars or more efficient diesel trucks. We actually need to flip to electricity, in some cases a bit of biofuels, and hydrogen perhaps made cleanly. And so I think we're in a space where Canada will for sure be in discussions with the Americans, and there is something to hope for. Now, when you get to what are often almost half the emissions in any economy, which is the major industrial sectors which compete globally, that's when it's going to get interesting because Biden is not in a position to put in that carbon pricing. And so it could be interesting if he tries other kinds of regulations on emissions, say of a steel plant, but ties this to some kind of carbon tariffs to protect those steel industries. So, and that's when Canada can be involved as well. So when I think about Biden, and I'm just in a predictive mode, this is what I think are really the only options available to him. So I don't see a carbon tax, and I don't even see a cap and trade. It was 15 years ago, John McCain, a Republican, almost got a cap and trade bill through. It was a bipartisan bill. You're not going to see that in the United States today.
Well, Mark, so what are the federal climate policies you think have worked or are putting us on the right trajectory in Canada?
So, as you mentioned, I've been in this game a long time. I finished my PhD in France and came back to Canada, and it was a new professor at Simon Fraser University, and the Mulroney government sent me to a meeting in Paris of energy economists. It was at the International Energy Association from countries from around the world, because suddenly, okay, let's act on climate. And I came, and all of us went back to our countries and said, put on a carbon tax. And the Scandinavians did that right away. There's proportional representation perhaps for you, but I know it's not just that. But since then, the Mulroney government, the Chrétien government, and the Harper government, federally in Canada, score perfectly on the criteria in my book for climate insincerity. And that doesn't mean they don't care as people or didn't want to try to act, but they didn't implement the carbon pricing or the regulations that are needed to overcome the inherent benefits and advantages of fossil fuels. You want to decarbonize, you've got to have what we call compulsory policies. Sure, you can dress it up and make it more palatable with some subsidies for people to retrofit homes or buy electric cars, with some Rick Mercer commercials, with some voluntary stuff. That can all help. Like I'm not. I mean, I probably sound like I'm making fun of it, but those things are there. But you have to get into the it's pricing, putting a price on emissions or regulations. And fortunately, leading jurisdictions around the world are doing this. And we have examples. I mean, California, Quebec, British Columbia especially stand out. Rachel Notley tried to do some wonderful things as a leader of Alberta, incredibly difficult job. And the Ontario government phasing out its coal plants in 10 years. I use that example all the time of just what's possible and how quickly. So when I think about our federal government, though, it's not until 2015, with the election of the Trudeau government, that over the next year, they tried to get all the provinces to come along with them, the pan-Canadian framework, which a lot of us knew wouldn't last and didn't matter. And we're waiting for, no, this has to be a federal responsibility. If provinces want to lead, that's great, and encourage them. There's a good relationship between the federal government and British Columbia government right now on climate. But the policies are, they said, we're going to phase out coal plants. And we're going to use the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the regulation that Stephen Harper actually started, but didn't really have any teeth in it, and have set CO2 per kilowatt hour. That's all you need to set. And they've done it so that the coal plants are gone by 2030. It's still not restricted enough. It should be CO2 per kilowatt hour so that you can't replace them with natural gas baseload plants. And that's where the struggle is right now. But that's a very good policy, and it should be easy to ramp it up. And so far, it's the most important policy. So you might say, oh, but the carbon tax. No, that's the one. Just like Ontario phasing out coal plants was the most important.
Well, so that brings us to my next question, which is in terms of like being able to evaluate the different parties and their policies, coming into a federal election sometime maybe in the fall, like how can citizens evaluate the different party platforms, the NDP versus the Green versus the Liberals?
I didn't know you were going to pivot in that direction just yet. And I'll just, to answer your previous question, then then there is the carbon price, which is becoming more important and affecting domestic sectors like transportation and buildings. But then they're putting in regulations as well. The clean fuel standard in transportation. It's harder with buildings. They're putting in methane regulations. And then our industrial, which is almost half of our emissions, is a system of cap and trade, but it's a carbon intensity cap and trade. It's called the output-based pricing system. And it's a way of trying to give a signal that encourages greenhouse gas reducing actions in industry without raising its cost of production so much that it's in trouble with its global competitors. And so you can only go that far, which is why eventually you have to team this with some kind of carbon tariffs to make sure the whole world is acting. So that's my slate of these. Now, if you're trying to compare, so let's say—
before you move to that now, Mark, can I just follow up with a question, which is, what is it, do you think, that Canadians don't understand yet about what's already going on? And what do they need to know? Is the media doing a good job of communicating? Are the Liberals doing it? I mean, do we really know what's going on in Canada?
So one of the fun tests I do with grad students when I get them and at various times is I catch them when they are saying things like, we need to better communicate this policy, or we need more Canadians to understand that policy. And I think, and so I once, with a student of mine, Katja Rhodes, who's now a professor at the University of Victoria, and we did this wonderful survey. And it just, and there's other people who do that around the world. Ours fit right into that. It showed that most Canadians don't know anything about climate policy, and they never will. And I'm sorry, but that's the world. People have other things they're interested in. So what we should be working on if we want change is whether or not you can trust somebody on climate. And trust comes from several things. In the book, I try to point out the simple indicator. You don't need to know the output-based pricing system and the electricity CO2 phase out and the exact price of the carbon tax. What you need to know is, and I have this flow chart that my students helped to design for the concerned citizen, and it says, I need to know if they're using the compulsory policies. So that's a carbon price of some kind, and or regulations, one or the other, or both. And then I need to hear from experts in the media that they're going to hit their targets. And so when Andrew Scheer ran in the last election, he said, here's what I'm going to do for climate. I'm climate sincere. And then a bunch of us, some of them my former students in different institutes and so on, simulated his policies and then showed to Canadians, no, emissions will actually go up if we do what he says. And later on, I've seen polls that showed, I'm not giving us the credit, but just that idea that enough people in the media, in influential organizations, did get a message across to Canadians that the Conservatives then, and I don't know if they're changing, but the Conservatives in that last election, and even Aaron O'Toole, I heard him admit this the other day, were not sincere and serious, and it was evident. So it's more to do with that. And that's why my book isn't trying to say, and my book isn't, some people might call it a policy book. It's not about policy wonk, arcane stuff. It's about strategy and identifying and then working together. So that's what I'm trying to say is what one needs to do. And then I could, if you want, go on to then how would you apply that to the Conservatives or the NDP?
Yes, please. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah.
So it's going to be really fun to watch the Conservatives over the next while. And, I'm again someone, hope springs eternal. I see, as I said earlier, that climate sincerity and effort in California, even among Republicans in California, they might think we're going a little too fast in California because we're way out ahead of the rest of the United States. But it's largely a bipartisan issue. To be legitimate, you sort of need to take climate seriously in California. Same thing in Scandinavia, Northern Europe, Western Europe. Same thing in Quebec. It's bipartisan. I remember when Quebec was developing its cap and trade with California, I was in meetings down in California, and the Californians said to the Quebec representatives, they said, you just got elected, and what if the next government you're going to get into this cap and trade with us, and then you're going to pull out? And the Quebec representative said, nope, it's a bipartisan issue. Everybody's on side. Now, of course, we know that in Ontario, it was still a partisan issue, and so Ontario pulled out of the cap and trade. But I think it's going to be fun to see what the Conservatives do, because Aaron O'Toole has been signaling in his media representation that he's going to be sincere. And here's my message to Canadians. Well, then, what's his 2030 target? Is it the same as what Trudeau has? And with that target, what are his policies? Does he have a carbon price or an equivalent regulation? And if it's a carbon price, it needs to be going up to $170 because the Liberals base that on modeling by experts. And if it's not the carbon price, it needs to be regulations that do the equivalent, and experts will tell us that. So that would be for them. Now, when I switched over to the NDP and Greens, it's challenging. And I didn't work as hard on evaluating their targets were way more aggressive, right? And I helped a little Elizabeth May a bit with her target. So they basically said, oh, no. Elizabeth said by 2030, I can't remember if it was 60% reduction or something like that. I want that message out there of how urgent this problem is, but it's also one that will be hard to win in a democracy because you're then trying to transform physical structures, buildings, transport equipment before they've gone through their natural economic life. And so the faster you try to transform something, the more expensive it gets. And that's why often we talk about, you know, the decarbonization transition as a multi-decade transition. We need to see serious policy today, yesterday, that's moving us there. But it is taking a time. And so when I analyzed NDP and Green policies last time, I have to say some of them would have been quite devastating to the economy, but I didn't speak up too much about that.
The NDP and the Green. And
too much, too fast.
And when you say it would take decades, do you mean decades ending with 2030 or 2050? I mean, what do you think about those targets?
Oh, I do agree that we in rich countries need to get to close to zero in the 2050, 2060 timeframe. And I know climate scientists would be quite happy with that. I think the developing world will be slower, and that's scarier. But then I've told you about the kind of policies to prevent that from going crazy. It's kind of like if the Greens were to say, oh, these liberal and conservative targets for 2030 are not good enough, then they should get independent experts to simulate the kind of carbon tax you'd have to have and how that would impact the economy. And if we do that, we find some pretty crazy numbers out there. A carbon tax going to $500, $600. I'm not speaking from specific examples right now, but that's what I tend to see very quickly.
Mark, we have a few really interesting questions from the audience. We have quite a lot, and we're not going to be able to get to them all, but a number of questions are around hydrogen. Jim Hollingworth asks, what role will hydrogen play in Canada's energy mix in the next decade?
Great, thanks for that question. So I am an economist, and as an economist, I like to not predict which technology, like to try to encourage governments to put in price and regulation, flexible regulations that don't pick technology winners and then let it play out as it will. But of course, I do engage in this as sometimes. I had a student do a study 15 years ago called "Can Hydrogen Win?" and this was for light duty vehicles, the vehicles that personal vehicles that we have. And she showed that, oh my goodness, government would have to make major infrastructure investments in both the production of hydrogen, its transport, and then its distribution for, in gas stations or whatever. So you need if you want a hydrogen future, you need a major role for government to do this. And maybe that is what we're going to need to do in trucking and other aspects of transportation. It could well be that we do that. We have the technologies. We can fly airplanes on hydrogen. The Russians had hydrogen.
Really?
Had hydrogen passenger jets in the 1950s.
Wow.
I mean, whenever anyone tells you that we have to wait for innovation, that has been untrue for 30 years. I've flown in a jet in Brazil that was from bio jet fuel 15 years ago as part of an IPCC meeting. So anyway, but I get off topic. So the book I did in 2004 called Sustainable Fossil Fuels, trying to tell people from Alberta that we don't need to annihilate your economy as part of solving this, so let's work together, did have hydrogen as a major part of it. And that was because the idea was, okay, people in Alberta don't just want to shut down tomorrow or shut down gradually. They want to see if they can compete in this world of zero emissions. And hydrogen and electricity, and in some cases, sustainably produced biofuels, can have a role to play in that mix. And lots of us forecast what they are. So my answer to Jim is that hydrogen could have a significant role, but it would depend on whether or not, well, first of all, you can make hydrogen from electrolysis of water and use renewable energy, hydropower, wind, solar. But it'll partly depend on how things play out sort of globally on major goods transportation, trains, ships, large trucks. And that's a hard one to predict because electricity is going to try to get into that market. And so is cleanly produced biodiesel. And I'll bet you there'll be a bit of a mix for quite some time as replacing fossil fuel derived. And then hydrogen for other things, and even coming from fossil fuel regions, because of those regions trying to hang on may also be interesting. And you can use hydrogen in buildings and of course, even in personal vehicles. Our Minister of Environment drives a hydrogen fuel cell car, Jonathan Wilkinson. But he told me the only refueling station is right near where he lives in North Vancouver. So anyway, hydrogen could be a big part of it, but it's very uncertain.
We have a question from James Doyle, who asks, what can I, at 15 years old, do to get change now?
Okay. I mean, I think young people have been setting an example for all of us. And I think that activism is really important. It puts pressure on politicians. Exactly how that should manifest, I think there are many different ways. Now, and I'm really talking about a pre-COVID world right now, because COVID took the wind out of the sails of what was a very interesting and promising youth movement on climate that does pressure business leaders, politicians, even the media in its focus, to get us into thinking about this problem and getting it in the spotlight, and that can help things move along. So I would argue that the example of Greta Thunberg was a very good one. Now, I also know that, of course, she's a young person and she doesn't always know all the constraints in a democracy. And sometimes it sounds like she's almost ranting to governments that are actually trying to do some really good things. And it's like, oh my goodness, come with me to Vietnam the next time that we're doing planning, or Indonesia or Tanzania, because that's where the emissions are growing. And it's really hard for the wealthy countries to force or even subsidize that. I mean, I'm in the game of, or in the world of, I teach an undergraduate course. I'm going to be giving my last lectures tomorrow in sustainable energy. And the young people in there are so inspiring to me. And they go in, and because I've been teaching for a long time, I'm always asking them, tell me what go do this. There are so many things you can do to be part of a clean energy future. And there's so many jobs related to that, whether it's market development or computer support or new technology development or policy, or planning and urban planning. So there are so many things you can do, but activism among young people and all of us is a big thing. And I describe how strategic that can and should be and how essential it is in my book.
Mark, we're going to do one more question from the audience and then go back to the interview. This question comes from Ann McAllister, who asks, what's your opinion of the claim that developing new nuclear power plants and associated infrastructure has a role to play in decarbonizing Canada's economy?
Right. So because of this question and the hydrogen question, I just want to point out one little aspect of my book. One of the things that I think is a really good question, and I will answer it. But one of the things that I try to emphasize, and it's part of how I teach, and I talk about this a fair bit in the book, is to try to stay away from rigid pro or con positions. It doesn't mean of course you can have a position on something, but if someone's really good on arguing for small modular nuclear reactors, I want them to know the very best arguments against them as well. So pro and con. Same thing with biofuels, same thing with large hydro, there's so many things where one of the things that really hurts us is that people who are climate concerned, they think the answer only has to be this, and they're actually quite intolerant of other options out there. So small nuclear reactors could be a part of this. I mean, solar and wind are just doing wonderfully, and we need a lot of electricity, but we do need ways of backing up that electricity with batteries. But how much batteries are we going to make? You can have hydrogen even in generators, which is there, stored in hydrogen, ready to produce electricity when the wind isn't blowing and the sun's not shining. And possibly in some places in the world, small nuclear will have a role to play. But it would also surprise me if it didn't. And the reason is because we have other options. And so the small nuclear should have to compete with those other zero emission options. And it should have to compete on a full basis. So it's just as if we're talking about batteries, it's what are we doing with the batteries when we're not using them anymore? How are we recycling that material? How's that part of the cost? And if I'm doing nuclear, what am I doing with the nuclear waste? Have I worked out a way to deal with that? And it's turned, we're having a lot of trouble. All of the countries that have used nuclear for electricity generation are having trouble dealing with the nuclear, the radioactive rods, and so the fuel, the spent fuel, as well as some of the equipment itself. And so that's a challenge for nuclear. And then where nuclear might make more sense is in the developing world, but that's often in countries where it isn't the best institutionally for safety mechanisms and telling the truth about irresponsible management and so on. So nuclear has got a real challenge there.
That's so interesting, Mark. I've just been reading Bill Gates's book about solving the climate crisis, and he advocates really strongly for nuclear and says that nuclear has to be part of that. We actually have to increase our nuclear capacity, nuclear power plants, that is. And he says that there have been so many fewer, this is his argument, that there have been so many fewer people that have actually died because of the nuclear power plant meltdown than if you compare it to like cars on the road and traffic accidents and highway accidents, that so many more people have died, but we don't outlaw cars. So do you think he's just off track there?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually seen him speak about this, but I haven't read his argument in his book yet. So I want to be careful that that maybe I'm missing something that he said. But
Sure.
my answer will be similar to the one I just gave, which is that I want to be careful about saying it's going to be hydrogen in trucking or bio jet fuel in airlines or nuclear for electricity. It's really going to play out differently in different jurisdictions. So if I were in Germany today, I'd be closing the coal plants before I close the nuclear plants. But I'd probably eventually be looking into closing the nuclear plants because I think you can do that. If I were in Scandinavia today, I'd probably keep the nuclear plants running. In Japan, I would probably do that. In the United States, I think it's really hard to say. So the challenge for nuclear. So first of all, do we need nuclear? No. So many of the scenarios that are plausible, done by the Global Energy Assessment, which I was involved in, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I've been involved in, have shown scenarios in which nuclear doesn't grow and is sort of kind of fading out. So it goes from 4 or 5% of the global energy system today to down to 1% or something like that. So it isn't essential.
Right.
But the alternative ones can be a bit more expensive. But even that's not sure, because when we try to build a nuclear plant, the siting costs are so huge that they're always running over budget. And when people say, well, small modular reactors will be different, I don't know about that because you're still going to have to site it somewhere. And so there's all this overhead of costs of politics, politicals, permitting, and so on, and security. And so a nuclear plant almost benefits from economies of scale in all the administrative and safety and regulatory stuff. To do all these small ones, I don't know. So I think nuclear has some strong winds blowing against it, even in a world in which we're moving rapidly towards zero emission.
Oh my God. I cannot believe we're 7 minutes away from the end of the hour mark. I have a couple of more questions that I really want to get to. My first one is, you were arrested in 2012 for blocking a coal train. Masses of people are marching for climate action, as you were referring to earlier, or against different fossil fuel projects, yet we still see weak climate action by many levels of government. So what role do you've already spoken to this a little bit. I guess I'd like to know from you, do you think that as we move out of COVID and into the future, that civil disobedience is going to play a big role in moving the dial on our race against climate change?
I alluded to in this in our this wonderful conversation to a flow chart in my book that is what you'd call a contingent flow chart. So some people are like, I'm going to do civil disobedience no matter what on the Trans Mountain Pipeline or whatever. And that was not my approach. My approach was hoping to get through life without doing civil disobedience. It's not something, I mean, I really read a lot about civil disobedience before engaging in this. I'm a law-abiding, I see myself as a law-abiding citizen. Um, but as Bill McKibben has said, planet Earth is outside of its comfort zone. Maybe a lot of us need to be ready to do that as well. If I have success, if my region, my electoral region has success in electing climate sincere governments that are doing policies that make a difference, then I wouldn't be engaged in civil disobedience. So my decision to act in 2013 was when the government federally in Canada was the Harper government, which was clearly faking it on climate. And the government in British Columbia, where I live, was the Christy Clark government, which was clearly faking it on climate. And at that point, I felt, or I was convinced by colleagues of mine, former students, that while I had some stature as someone who had appeared before parliamentary and U.S. In committees at the U.S. Capitol, European Parliament, British Columbia Utilities Commission, that it would help if someone who had those avenues still was willing to engage in civil disobedience. So I did. With the Trans Mountain Pipeline, colleagues and friends said, well, let's do that again. And I said, well, no, actually, because my goodness, we've got a federal government that is now the most active, the most climate sincere, that when I'm talking to my colleagues on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they can't find one that's comparable. I want to support that government. I want to have some sympathy for the difficult trade-offs they have to make. And that's why I was not engaged that way. I do believe we need civil activism because for when we are faced with climate insincere governments and we've failed to unelect them. And the reason is we need everything we can for other citizens to see, oh, this is important. So you're trying to get as many people involved as possible. And that's why I'm a huge fan of Greta Thunberg and other people like her, and amazed that such young people are able to do that. And so I'm just all, how can I help you? With statements or whatever, how can people like me help you? And that's important.
What is the one key thing people can do to achieve climate success, Mark?
So I think you're going to guess that I don't like having to give a single answer. My answer is probably contingent. First of all, when people are telling you all this behavior stuff, all this, do this, do that, if you want to eat less meat, I am almost entirely a vegetarian. I very rarely eat meat. And I do that for health reasons, but also, animal welfare, caring about the planet. That's great. We see that in some cases, meat eating is going up in the developing world, where people are getting more wealth and they're trying to get protein. And so these kind of behavioral changes are things to strive for. But thankfully, we don't have to sort of wrap up, all of these things have to happen in the next 2 or 3 decades to save the planet from greenhouse gases. And so there are things that we can do now in a wealthy country like Canada, where you can either stop using a car, but a lot of people are going to use a car. So set an example for others, buy a car by yourself that's electric, or buy it with some other people, or work out a way to use it collaboratively. Or, when people say to me electric cars are too expensive, I say, forget it. I bought my first electric car with someone else, and I don't use it much because I'm mostly a transit cyclist, but I wanted to help create that market and that perception to help change the world. And then the second thing is how your building is heated. About 40% in British Columbia, for example, of buildings are heated with electricity. I think in Ontario, it might be 35%. And maybe my numbers are a bit off, but it's in that range. We're already using a lot of electricity for heating buildings. We need that amount to go up, and maybe some biomethane along with that to replace natural gas, fossil fuels from natural gas. So guess what? When we do that in our personal lives, you've now eliminated about 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions you're responsible for with just those two things. So there's things you can do in your personal life. It's called fuel switching. And there are things you can do in your citizen's life. And it's called being engaged and active, both in the political process, but if necessary, and being strategic when you vote and when you talk to others about that. And then if necessary, being civil active as well. And I think you should be anyway.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Tonight's episode with Mark Jaccard was produced by Sharayer Tajdidi at the Canadian Centre for Journalism. And I want to thank my other colleagues, Janelle Johnson, Jenny Uechi, Yamina Salamlal, and Polly Legier. Next up on April 22, that's Earth Day, we're going to be chatting with Elizabeth May. What a great way to spend Earth Day.
If I can just throw in one thing, thanks,
sure.
Linda. I didn't know when to say that. And so just also to let people know that, of course, I'm on Twitter, but also at markjaccard.com, you can see videos, 4-minute videos of different key concepts in the book. And so thank you for letting me cut in just to do that little
plug. Sure. And Mark, thank you again for joining us. I hope to all see you next time. It's been great to see you tonight, Mark. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.